Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Today we have John Stewart from Music and Theater Arts, and I'm going to let him introduce his own talk and talk about what he's going to talk about.
Thank you. Well, first, thanks for giving up your lunchtime and coming in. I actually wasn't sure I would have much of an audience because it's a pretty specific topic, dealing with music and repertoire for the ensembles. My role, just so everybody knows, I am the director of concert bands where I conduct the Wind Symphony here on campus is kind of my main responsibility, but also a member of the music education faculty. Going into my 6th year here at UW Eau Claire, and prior to that I was a high school teacher in Florida for about 14 years. So the idea of giving students a well-rounded music education has always been really important to me, and now as we look at our EDI efforts at the university, it really made me question, well, how good of a job are we doing making sure that we are representing enough diversity and inclusivity in our music and the repertoire that we're teaching. So this is a research project that started just over a year ago now. It's still in the works a little bit, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about it and share some of the things I've learned and some of the things that we're doing to help fix some of the issues that you're going to see on some of the graphs here in a little bit. So there's 3 real things that I'm going to talk about today. Why do we need to add diversity to our programming? The trends of Eau Claire Concert Bands from 1987 to 2017, the last 30 years. I'm in the process of going all the way back as far as I can to the late 50s, the early 1950s, but I had to stop at some point, so the 30-year mark at this point seemed pretty logical. What I've learned of the different ensembles, because we have three ensembles that we deal with, and then some ways to provide more diversity, some things that we're doing in our programming with the Wind Symphony and the Symphony Band especially, which are the 2 ensembles that deal mostly with music majors. Things that we're doing to try to help make sure our students are getting this repertoire that we need. So the first thing, getting to why, as a teacher conductor, it's important for us to provide students with a lot of variety of experiences. I deal with a lot of students from different majors, mostly music majors, but within that I have music ed majors, I have performance majors, liberal arts majors, music minors, and then we have a few in my ensemble that are just very, very talented majors of other things than music. They just love to play and perform at a high level. So I've got all these individual needs that I need to try to make sure that I cover. So to do that, I was like, well, what are we doing? For example, the music ed majors, I have to make sure there's a certain core repertoire that they know, and composers, and stay current with new composers as they're getting ready to go out and teach. And the research also shows that students, music ed majors, model a lot of their future teaching after what happens in the ensemble setting. Despite what happens in our theory and history and studio classes, a lot of what they do is they teach in the large ensemble. So we have to provide those ensemble experiences to model how to teach, model pedagogy, model repertoire for our students. For our performance majors, an example I just was talking to one of them the other day about is I have to say, you know what, if I don't teach you how to play a march at some point when you're here, if you ever audition for a military band, I've failed you as a teacher, because you have to be able to play marches to get one of those professional military jobs. So we have to make sure there's certain styles of music that the performance majors have. And then the liberal arts majors and minors, making sure it's a good broad-based education to help round them out. And then our non-majors as well, to give them the experience, because they're eventually going to be hopefully lifelong lovers of music, but also the patrons of the arts. So we want to make sure that they've got a good breadth of information to go on and move forward. So just a little bit about how I got to this. So in addition to my personal beliefs, I started looking at some of the current research. The Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, one of our nation's largest professional orchestras, who is music director, happens to be a female, for the last several years has been doing research of what the major orchestras and now what they call the second-tier orchestras, the larger regional orchestras, are programming. And for the last several years, the average date of the piece being written was 1885 to 1887. The most frequently performed composers are Mozart, Beethoven, Handel. the giants that we know and the ones that we teach a lot of our students from a musical history standpoint, and that lens is important. But it kind of makes you go, are we not living with the times? Because when these composers were living, all the music that was being performed was by living composers. So why are we still performing most of our music by deceased composers and not so much? So then they also started to compare the genders, male to female. And of the seasons of all these major orchestras like Chicago Symphony, Minnesota, New York Phil, Cleveland, only 1.8% of those compositions were composed by female composers. That's kind of scary. It's kind of sad in a way. But if you look into the living composers, the percentage looks a little bit better, but still not good enough, I don't think. The College Band Directors National Association, which I'm a member of, last year at their the national conference in Nashville, they looked at a research study of all their regional and national programs from 1951 to present day. Every other year they do a national conference, and then the off years they do a regional conference. So there might be 8 or 9 different regions to perform. So they looked at the same thing, say, okay, how are we doing? As in relation to just the whole male-female discussion, because the female composers are generally a historically underrepresented population. And they went, yay, we're doing better. And they kind of said it sarcastically like that, because we're at 2.8%. I don't know if we should brag about that, but I guess it's progress. I don't know. And the enlightening thing at that conference was they also, of the 9 top collegiate ensembles around the country that performed, there were 9 concerts, each concert about an hour long. There was only one piece composed by a female composer. And as part of that conference, they actually had a session on it, and that composer, Jennifer Jolly, was present with a female conductor and some others, and they talked about this need for programming diversity and including women. And so Jennifer even talked about some of the issues she believed as a woman, which was kind of enlightening. And I'm not going to go into all of that now, but it was just interesting to hear her perspective on why she felt people weren't performing women's works. But a lot of it came down to the fact that just a lack of knowledge on our part. Even female conductors were like, well, who are the female conductors? So people have done some work over the last couple of years, and it's actually growing like wildfire, which is exciting to see, but it's hard to keep up with all the changes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then another reason why is most of our students learn their repertoire through their performance ensembles. They get a lot of the important things in history classes, like I said before, but the current trends, they get it in these ensembles. We perform 4 concerts, 5 concerts a year, on average 5 or 6 pieces a year. So they're learning over the course of their 4 years here a lot of different music, and it's our job to make sure that we're providing this diversity for them. And then obviously with our new initiatives with EDI, and this project started, and I started thinking about it before the ball really got rolling on all the initiatives. I was like, well, if we're going to do this, I need to be proactive and see what we're doing. So it got me thinking as an educator, what are we doing? How are we doing? Which was kind of enlightening. I'll let you soak that in for a minute. Broken down into 10-year periods. This little sliver in 1987 to 1997 represents one piece of music composed by a female composer by 3 bands over a 10-year period. Different time period. EDI I don't think was really as in everybody's forefront of mind at that point, but it was kind of depressing when I found this out and I looked at it. This was actually back when we had a graduate program, which we don't anymore. And it was actually a piece that was conducted by one of our graduate students with our non-major band, and that graduate student happened to be also an African American. So it was like our one time we've had a diverse conductor of one of the ensembles, actually is the one person that programmed a piece by a historically underrepresented female composer, which I thought was enlightening. You can see the next 10-year period, it was a little bit better. I'm going to peek at my notes so I can give you the exact numbers. There were still not very many there. And then the third year, this third cycle is the last 10 years, and it looks better, but it's still not great. So for example, this last 10-year period, there were 26 pieces performed by the three ensembles that were performed by female. And I'm focusing on that right now because there's so much more to dig into with the data. This was kind of our first attempt to start making this happen. If we dig deeper into this last 10-year period and look for the last 5 years of that, most of the pieces, 26, there were 32 works during the 10-year period. 26 of them were performed in the last 5 years. So in the last 5 years, I think we're doing a much better job. Still not good enough, in my opinion. But we're finally starting to get there. And if I were to do one, you know, hopefully the next 10 years, hopefully it's going to be much more representative of the ensembles and what they're doing and what we would like to accomplish. The next thing, as I mentioned back in the before with the Baltimore Symphony, you know, most of those composers at the time, it was new music. They were composing music, new music. So again, first year time period, 10-year period, 74% of works were by deceased composers. So we weren't even programming current music at that time. Next 10-year period, we did a little bit better. And then this last 10-year, you can see that we've actually swayed over where we're playing more relevant music, or not necessarily relevant, but more by living composers. We're getting a better balance of 50-50 with the historic repertoire that our students need to know, the core music, and that new composers that are now living and now writing for the medium. So I think we're doing a little bit better there. I still would like to see it a little bit more balanced from a more 50-50 perspective. But it was still an enlightening thing for me to figure out and to see what was going on, at least looking at these two factors. The next point of the data is to keep going and start looking at ethnicities and see how we're doing there and making sure, because, you know, from being from Florida originally, my ensemble looked much different than it does here at Eau Claire. The number of minorities in our ensemble right now pales in comparison. Maybe bad choice of word there, but compared to what it did in Florida, because I taught at a school that was about 50% Hispanic in Florida. Here, I think I have one Hispanic student, maybe one Asian American student. So I tell people, look at your ensemble. Are you playing music that's written by composers that look like your students? And a lot of teachers come back to me and say, well, no, I'm not. I'm performing a lot of pieces that were written by people that look like me. I was like, do you see there's a problem there? And they're like, well, some at first are like, no. I'm like, are you sure? And they start thinking about it more. I'm like, well, yeah, maybe. Because in conversations with other people, Roderick Cox, who's the associate conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra, African American, talks about his experiences as an African American conductor, never saw himself or imagined himself being an orchestral conductor, because the way out of the neighborhood, as he says, was sports. It was basketball. He saw African American basketball. That was the way out, until somebody saw something in him and his musical ability to say, you should give this a shot. Now is the associate conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra and just taking the world by storm. Has been guest conductor all over the world doing things. So we have a responsibility, I think, to provide those opportunities for our students to say, ladies, you can do this too. You know, African American students, you can do this too. Here are some pieces that have been composed, or some conductors, and interact with these artists and musicians that look like them, not that just look like me. And I feel strange, honestly, I feel like I'm being the advocate for everybody else, but I'm the married white male with, you know, a beautiful daughter. So it's like, well, shouldn't other people be doing this? But I feel it's part of my responsibility to, as a student, as a teacher, to continue to learn and continue to pass this on and say, you know what, we need to stand up for everybody else and make this a possibility for all of our students. So with that, and I'm moving quick so we can get to questions if you have them, we've made a commitment, myself and talking to Phil Ostrander, my colleague who teaches our symphony band, we've made a commitment to make some changes to our programming practices. One of those changes right away was say, we're going to focus on making sure that we include at least one underrepresented composer on every concert. So if we do 4 or 5 pieces, we're at least at 20–25% now, making sure that that's happening. That's better. It's not great, it's not ideal. But we're like, let's start small, because if we change things up completely, we don't want to abandon where we came from. We want to make sure that we still balance the repertoire. So we started with let's program 1, and then throughout our discussions we're like, okay, so what we're going to do, last fall in October we actually did an all-female composers concert. Both bands did compositions by females, which was great, but it was really hard to find, so it was a good challenge for us to find great pieces by women composers. But, and also talking to those female composers, some other issues came up, and they're like, well, why are you making a big deal out of doing an all-females composers concert? It shouldn't be a big deal. It should just be like, hey, we're doing a concert, and it just happens to be. So some people are getting offended when you're doing these themed concerts that feature all of one underrepresented area, which I found interesting. And then luckily I've got some friends that are good enough friends to say, be careful. So when I talk to my students, I say, you can do this, but you have to make sure it's not a one-time thing. Don't make it a token concert, okay? Or don't make that your concert that includes all this underrepresented composers and then move on and do everything else like we have been. Make sure that you keep a thread going all the way through the season and through the year. With our university band, which is our large band that Dr. Dickerson conducts, is also frequently has senior music ed majors, student conduct that ensemble. So I've really worked with those students to try to say, I really would like you to give them the autonomy to find a piece, but to help guide them and say, go find a piece that's by an underrepresented composer to include in the programming. So we've been working through that to make that. We've done some themed concerts, like I said, the all-female composers. And again, making sure that it's not just all like white female composers, that we're making sure that we've got diversity within that as well. I kept the thread all the way through the year to make sure that we had the underrepresented composer. For me, the theme last year was all making sure that we had women composers represented all year. Same thing is happening this year. Dr. Ostrander went through and he did more theme, like here was all women composers, the next concert was like all Latin American composers, the next was all African American composers. So his was more themed generally to make sure that we encompassed all of that with ethnicities as well. We've also started to make changes for me in the music ed curriculum and in talking with our music ed colleagues into making sure that we're including more works and examples by these underrepresented composers as well, so that they're starting to become familiar with the repertoire, they're starting to become familiar with the names, so they can then have that knowledge to go out and do this. And then commitment to help commission. That to me is big. We're trying to stay current with music, we want to be cutting edge as well as remember our past. So over the last 5 years, we've either commissioned or helped commission 7 diverse composers to write pieces for the wind band medium. And any of our resources that we can, I've been really trying to channel any of our financial means into helping with this process. And it's been a really important thing for us, and it's been important for our students and the women last year in the ensemble after we did that first concert. Really tried not to, we kind of tried to downplay the fact that it was an all-female concert and we mentioned it like once, and then later in the process we're like, wait a minute, these are all women's names, and so they kind of like, they started to feel a little bit more empowered. And in talking to them, we were able to bring one of the composers in who's Asha Srinivasan, who's on the faculty at Lawrence University, Indian American, born in India, and has moved and is a U.S. citizen now, but she was able to come in and spend some time with the ensemble. We Skyped her in and she came to the concert. But the women then all felt empowered and they're like, oh yeah, I could do this too. And they thanked us and said, thank you for not making it a big circus like some people have with things. So we're trying to find that balance. We're still learning a lot during the process of doing this, but we feel that it's really important, and I feel it's really important to do this for our students so that we can help move things forward to get better balance, because ideally I would like both of those charts. You know, if I could break it down by not just male, female, but here's our historically represented and our historically underrepresented, does it look 50-50? That's kind of, I think, the ultimate goal for us. And then can we get a better balance of 50-50 between living and deceased composers as well? Thankfully, there are now many more resources. 2 years ago, most of these weren't possible. These resources weren't possible. This first one is the Composer Diversity Project, which is an online resource. And actually, it's sad in a way, but also kind of funny. Some composers are like, well, where is this person on there? And it's like, it's composer diversity, not here's more compositions by white people. But it's all people of other ethnicities that are not necessarily white Americans, but it's more females and composers from around the world to help us learn who these minority composers are. And it's been great. And Rob Deemer, who's the faculty composition teacher at Fredonia University, is the one that has spearheaded this project. And it started as a female composers database, and he crowdsourced. He just emailed us all and said, hey, who are the women that we need to know? Who is composing for band or orchestra or choir? Not just our area, but what are the pieces? What are their websites? So he just did a Google form, and we all started contributing to this giant Google document for him. Then he took his graduate students, and they went and created this database. It's now searchable. You can go, hey, I want to find a piece for orchestra that's by an Asian composer that's for young orchestra. And you can just click these boxes, and it'll filter it down and give you a list of names. And then you can click on it and go right to their websites. Which has been part of the problem, because now composers are more frequently self-publishing instead of going through main publishers, because the big publishers don't give them a lot of profit when they sell through them. And so now if they're their website and publishing themselves, it's harder to find them. So it's nice to kind of have these resources in one site. The composers' web pages. Professional organizations, thankfully, have started to become more aware of it. The College Band Directors National Association is really pushing to help it. I'm a member of the World Association of Symphonic Bands and Wind Ensembles, and through our commissioning that we do for there, we're really trying to target the underrepresented population as well, to try to help make sure that not just here in the US, but globally, we're trying to make sure that we're having an impact to make people more aware, and then trying to find those great composers, regardless of medium, and commission them to write new works, especially for bands. And then the Wind Repertoire project was a wiki that was actually created as a doctoral project by one of my friends, where we can all contribute our concert programs to. So it's a nice resource to be able to go in and see all these composers, and he's got a searchable database there as well, to learn about composers and just to see what people are programming around the country. So it's kind of nice. The next steps, and then before I guess I shouldn't have done that. The next steps for me, like I said, are to continue to dig a little bit deeper into this and see, you know, I focused a lot on the male-female aspect of this, because I had to start somewhere. And when I look at my ensemble, it's more of a 50-50 balance of male to female students. It's like, well, okay, I'm not serving these students as well as I should, so let us start there and try to figure out how to balance that. Now we'll start working on the other things, because as we try to help make the university more diverse as well, we need to be performing works that those students, when we're out recruiting, are seeing us perform, and they're like, oh, that name, that resonates with me, because that's of my culture, that's of my heritage, so that I can see myself going there, because they would support me in a way, instead of, hey, come here and do stuff that doesn't look anything like me. So we want to make sure we've built in that infrastructure and through support through our repertoire and planning, and that's kind of where we're going.
What historically, you know, you mentioned Bach and Handel and that sort of stuff. Those are big names. Were there, or are there many historical female composers? And like percentage-wise, is it like 5%? If you think of, you know, pre-1900, let's just say. And you may not know, but I'm just talking, you know, big picture here. And then in terms of today, how many female composers are there out there?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned it was hard, at least at first, to try to identify that. Has that switched in terms of the number of women who are, I'm specifically talking male, female, as you were.
Right.
So just to kind of, you know, you could say I want to have all of the concerts this entire year all be by female composers, but if there aren't enough female composers to do that,
Right.
then that makes it really difficult. So, like, what are the numbers, I guess?
Right. Historically, it's hard to put a number on, but I just think back to my background in learning music history. It's like, I even ask our students, like, how many females do you talk about? And they're like, I think they name 4 or 5. So historically, it's hard to identify how many there were, because so many of it was like, well, if you're a female, you can't do this. So, or they would change their names. So there's some of that, and then in our history classes, and Ryan could probably address this better as a historian, historically about that. But I think now in present day, I think there are a greater percentage of females composing, as an example, but it's our lack of knowledge, and up until recently, the lack of resources to help us learn who those names are. I mean, I go to the Composer Diversity Project and just scroll through names, and I'm blown away by the names. I'm like, I don't recognize 75% of a lot of these names, and I've got a pretty good background on the wind band repertoire especially. And I start looking at it going, oh, I need to learn this. Who's this person? And I try to go to their website and see. So I think there is a greater percentage now. Still, if you look at it 50-50, it's still not there. But I think there are enough great works by females that we can try to strive to balance that a little bit more. So, yeah.
And just out of curiosity, going back, you know, you mentioned Mozart and Bach and all those, and for the public, in a way, those are sort of like, you know, musical comfort food, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's what people know and are familiar with. And do you have any sense on the audience reaction or for some of these programming changes, either from things you've seen, and I'm not exactly sure how you measure that, you know, is it audience attendance, or I don't know what it would be, or from other colleagues and people that are participating in the diversity project and others from their institutions? Because, I mean, it seems like the changes are well-deserved and well thought out from the student educational perspective. And I'm just curious if there's anybody who's looking at it from the audience receptivity perspective.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I know in talking with like orchestral colleagues, for example, they have their patrons that they have to worry about. And a lot of their patrons, and even I went to the Chicago Symphony concert last year when I was in Chicago, and I got to sit on the choir seating, so I got to actually see most of the hall. And you look at the hall, and it's mostly white people with gray hair. Yeah, old white people. I'm like, okay, so we're doing that, and they're playing old dead white people's music. Yeah, I'm like, okay, so
Who are the old dead white people? The composers or the people in the audience?
Yeah, it depends on the piece. Yeah. Yeah, so I think some of it is they're trying to fill seats. So people, you're right, people love, you know, the Mozarts and the Beethovens and the Bachs. They love hearing those things, and they're like, ooh, they're doing this symphony. I'm going to go hear this because it stood the test of time. Some newer works, because the harmonic language has shifted form. They're experimenting with adding electronics to music and things. And they've been doing that for years, but I think for some people it's not as comforting. It's not as predictable if you don't know the current trends. So I think some are afraid to make that shift and say, hey, we're going to commission a new person to do this because we still have to fill seats because we have to make a profit. So I think some of it's that way. I'm seeing from a higher ed standpoint, in the institution, I'm seeing more colleagues program for diversity for the educational benefits. But you look at like our professional wind bands, like the Dallas Wind Symphony and the big one in Tokyo, the Tokyo Kasei, their programming still kind of looks the same. They're doing works by living composers now, but they're not all programming a lot of diverse, that historically underrepresented group. It's still kind of like, hey, we're going to program our standards that we know are going to draw that in. And we try to balance it with ours, you know, like I said, including the one underrepresented composer, but also here's the underrepresented composer, but here's that core piece. Here's that piece that people are going to come in and go, hey, we're playing a whole suite, which for us is one of our historic great pieces that that people in our area love. So we're trying to balance it to give them something, but then also try to push the audience a little bit, but then also give our students those tools that they're going to need. Yeah, so it is a balancing act, and some have committed to, some orchestras have even committed to doing newer music and creating that diversity. One of the symphonies I was just reading published their season brochure. It looked like that original Baltimore Symphony study, and the patrons actually complained, people actually complained and gave them backlash. They actually reprogrammed some of the things to include some underrepresented composers for their season. So I think some other people in the community and some of the patrons, I think, are starting to speak up a little bit, going, hey, you know, we need to do a better job. There is great music out there, you know, that's currently being written that we want to hear. So, yes.
Is there any, I'm guessing there must be some evidence historically of female composers that might have been married to a musician who was also a composer, or maybe they were just both musicians that got married. The one was able to get their compositions out there, and maybe the wife or the female that they were connected to had contributed quite a bit to that composition, or even, you know, created it themselves, but a husband's name was put on it because it would be paid more attention to and that kind of thing. Is there anything out there like that? Because, you know, they say that about Einstein and his wife, you know, that she had some discoveries that she kind of was on her, you know, used his name for.
Right, yeah, that I don't know. Do you, Ryan?
I cannot give you one answer. It's not a wife-husband relationship, although I think there would be plenty of examples to go on about. But in the news recently, there was a music history book. There was a discussion of Felix Mendelssohn and Fanny Mendelssohn, brother and sister.